Well, I'm Stephanie Norander. I'm the Executive Director of the Communication Across the Curriculum program. It's a privilege to be here with you today and share in this webinar with you. We have 30 minutes planned for today, and we're going to be talking about providing formative feedback. My goal is to have time for questions at the end, but please do not hesitate to address the group either by unmuting your microphone, as Lynn talked about, or send a message if you have a question or something that you would like to share or idea you would like to add to the group. I welcome your participation. So as we get started, let me just talk very briefly about communication across the curriculum, because it provides our grounding principles from which we develop our webinar series. So communication across the curriculum is a faculty-focused resource here on campus. It's driven by enhancing student learning experiences, by integrating communication at the program level or the course level across all disciplines. And we do this for a couple of reasons. One is that we know that it better prepares students for life beyond their academic career, the better able they are to communicate across various forms. And two, we also know that it enhances and deepens their learning of content and disciplinary knowledge. So what we do is we work with faculty and departments to create multiple opportunities for students to develop communication competencies rather than just in one or two courses. We also work on ways to foster deep learning, student engagement, and student motivation, and promoting student success in the classroom and beyond. So today we're going to talk about one way to enact these principles is through providing formative feedback, and by attending to and paying close attention to how you incorporate the evaluation and feedback process in your course. Let me just say, before I preview what we're going to go into today, that providing formative feedback in the way that we're going to talk about today can be a little bit of a reframing for some, because we're going to talk about this from a stance of seeing grading and feedback as more than just assigning a letter grade. Instead, we're going to look at the way that we give feedback and the way that we conduct evaluation on student work as part of creating the overall context. And we want to do that in the ways that are most conducive to student learning. So that's going to be our focus today. We're going to talk about defining formative feedback, ways that you can practice effective formative feedback, and then how to integrate such strategies into your overall course design. And let me just say that we are going to scratch the surface in the short time that we have here today. I hope to introduce you to several different ideas and things that maybe help you think a little bit, or things that maybe reaffirm practices that you're already doing in your teaching. But we do offer consultation for any faculty across campus if you have questions or would like to talk about ways to do this in more in-depth ways, or how to look at your overall course, whether it be a small section course or a large section course. We'll be happy to sit down and talk with you about these ideas in more in-depth. Okay, so let's talk about what formative feedback is. Formative feedback is feedback that facilitates student learning. It sets the table for them going forward in their learning, and it provides us with information as instructors, and it also provides information to the students on how to refine our practices. So students get information about what behaviors they might need to change and how they can further enhance their learning opportunities. And as instructors, we get information by participating in the formative feedback process. We get information on tweaks and revisions that we may need to make to our instructional practices, because we get information about how students are learning and how they're meeting the criteria that we've set forward. This is in contrast to summative feedback, which evaluates learning, and that's information that's mostly used by the instructor to assign grades. And let me just note that today we are focused on feedback. You may also hear people talk about formative assessment and formative evaluation. We've intentionally titled this today feedback because we're focused on the types and forms of feedback that instructors give as part of an overall evaluation and assessment strategy. So do not let those terms confuse you. Just know that we're intentionally focusing on feedback. The important thing to keep in mind is that formative feedback can be used strategically to enhance student motivation and enhance learning. And that's our overall goal with wanting to incorporate this into our course. So let me pause here for a moment and ask you a reflective question. Thinking back over your learning experiences, what kinds of feedback have you appreciated and felt were productive in your past learning experiences? So if you take a moment and think about that, and my hope is that each of us have an example of when we received feedback that was really meaningful, it helped us move forward, it furthered our learning in a significant way. We have a good example of that. No doubt we probably also have an example at some point in time of feedback we received that really wasn't all that helpful or perhaps was even hurtful. Perhaps it threatened our identity or it challenged our sense of who we are. And we know that that kind of feedback does not facilitate further learning. So it's really important as we talk about formative feedback that we talk about ways to do it thoughtfully and reflectively. So if we talk about forms of effective feedback, we are talking about enacting the role of responder, not so much as the teacher who is judge or examiner, right? So this requires us, again, to reframe and think about what is our role in this relationship with students. And our role when we're talking about formative feedback is to respond. It's also important to think in terms of responding and not reacting to student work, right? We're responding thoughtfully. So here are some pointers on how to do this effectively. First of all, research has shown that the most effective formative feedback is timely. It's very close to the actual learning experience. It doesn't take place weeks or months later. It's very close. If not in real time, then very soon after a student has either completed an assignment or a learning experience. It's very specific, it's descriptive, and it's concrete. And by this, we mean that you're providing students with the immediate next steps. Again, this is in contrast to feedback that perhaps is very nice to hear but doesn't give us a lot to work with, such as great speech, right? Good job, well done. Those are all nice accolades to receive, but they do not provide us with formative feedback. And on their own, they don't give students the concrete next steps that they need to take in order to improve. And there's just not enough information there. Second, effective formative feedback balances strengths and weaknesses, and this is a real important one. We do not want to focus only on areas of where they need to make improvements, and we also want to find something about which we are providing feedback on that they're doing well. Right? And important to note here is that you also want to focus on the learning and not the student's identity. So I mentioned earlier that some negative examples of feedback are ones that threaten our identity. We're very sensitive to feedback. Learning and evaluation and feedback are relational processes, and we have a lot invested in them, both as instructors and as students. And so thinking carefully about both balancing those strengths and weaknesses, as well as how you your word choice in how you go about presenting that feedback. So for example, telling a student that if say you're looking at written work and you tell a student that you wrote a weak argument, right? Think about that in terms of a student's identity and how they might feel threatened by that or might have a very negative takeaway from that versus saying that the link between the evidence and the argument here is unclear, right? There, we're not making it personal. We're not involving the student's identity. We're focused on student learning. So you want to be conscientious of that as you balance those strengths and weaknesses and make sure that you're focused on learning and not student identity. Third, you want to prioritize big picture issues. So when we talk about effective formative feedback, we're not talking about the micro issues or looking at line-by-line editing, right, of written work or picking out smaller level concern mistakes in the work. We're looking at what will have the biggest impact on their learning. And we're going to talk here in a moment about how formative feedback can be part of your overall scaffolding and sequencing strategy. But you want to think about formative feedback as an opportunity early on to help students do the best that they can do and make the most improvements that they can with this learning experience. So therefore, this is not the time to comment on grammar and spelling. There might be broad-based comments on that, but that most likely comes later. This is the time to help them fix the big picture issues, the types of things that if they don't do well on this part or if they don't get this part of the assignment or the learning activity, they're not going to do well on the overall assignment or the overall project or the overall course. So big picture issues, the ones that are going to have the biggest impact on their learning. Finally, you want to think about incorporating formative feedback from multiple sources. One of the things that is common, one of the anxieties that's common for us as faculty to feel is that, gosh, I'd love to do formative feedback, right? I'd love to do more of it or even just do some of it, but I'm so scared by the workload. You do not have to tackle this on your own, nor does it need to be perhaps as big and overwhelming as what you are conceptualizing at first. And there's good research showing that students actually benefit from feedback from multiple sources. So what do I mean by this? Let's talk about how we share this workload. So you want to think about incorporating a mix of instructor, peer, and self-feedback in your overall strategy for how you tackle formative feedback. Now, this does not mean every assignment, every step of the way, every single time needs to have instructor, peer, and self. It means that over the course of the semester, you find ways to incorporate these at different points of time in ways that make sense. It's a strategy that you've developed, again, in efforts to best enhance and conduce student learning. So when we talk about instructors providing formative feedback, the most common type of feedback that we think of providing are brief written comments. Perhaps you have students draft a thesis statement for a project or a research question for an inquiry-driven project, and you provide comments on that. That's one effective way to do so. You can also provide audio comments. Canvas has a really easy-to-use audio feature, and there are other ways to do this as well, where you can actually record your comments. You can hold group or individual consultations with students to provide formative feedback. And you can also do this in class through discussion, orally, or by going around and meeting with different groups throughout class. So there are many ways that you can do this as an instructor, and the main point here is that it does not have to involve a significant amount of comments. It certainly does not involve copy editing. That's not at all what we mean by formative feedback. to be given at every single stage along the way of a project, a paper, a presentation development, whatever the case might be. So you can think about different ways that you can do that. And I want to emphasize the brief on comments here, and that goes back to thinking about those big picture issues versus the micro, very local level issues that a student might be struggling with. The second way is through peer feedback. Many of you perhaps have tried peer review or do peer review or at least have heard of peer review. Peer review can be very effective, but I cannot emphasize enough that you need to provide a process and a learning opportunity for students to understand what it is they need to do to carry out an effective peer review. So one common way to do this is provide them with a common feedback form. This could be in the form of a rubric or a list of criteria or a peer review feedback form that they are going to use to provide that feedback that you want them to on student work. What doesn't work is to just have students share their work and ask them just to give comments with no direction on what it is you're looking for. That usually backfires. You can also have students conduct peer review at different stages of a project. You can have them do in-class think, pair, share, where they're engaging in the brainstorming process and helping develop ideas or helping refine arguments or helping find sources or whatever the case might be. You can have them do that in helping practicing presenting work. You can also conduct more thorough peer review workshops, and we have a lot of really good resources for this, both in ways to do this for written work, for orally presented work, that you can set aside entire class times to peer review. Know that in order to be effective, that's not required. That's one way to do it, but you can also do peer review in more condensed formats. And you can incorporate it as part of your overall formative feedback strategy. And then lastly, we really promote incorporating self-feedback and opportunities for students to reflect on their own work. Again, that can be through a common feedback form. Perhaps they're filling out a form or answering questions or responding to how they think they did on their work, how they think they've made improvements, where they think they need help, what they're struggling with, or it could be filling out, again, a rubric with criteria and saying, here's how I think I did on this. You can also have them write up a small reflection that they turn in with a draft or that they share with you in some shape or form commentary on their work that gets them involved in that process of thinking about what are the other learning opportunities that they need in order to move this forward. So again, let me just say that this does not mean do all of these. This is a menu of options. You can maybe even think of others that you've incorporated that are a version of something of this. The important thing is that you think about how to do this intentionally and strategically. So that's what I'd like to talk about next is how do you integrate formative feedback. And I want to talk about two things that are really important. First of all is thinking about how to do this for students so that you make it part of that overall, like I said, context for teaching and learning. And then two, I'll talk about how you do this in a more practical aspect as an instructor. So first of all, an emphasis on formative feedback throughout your course can be really important for emphasizing to students that they have responsibility for their learning. And I encourage you to talk to them about this very much up front. Talk about the reasons that you do this, that you incorporate instructor feedback, peer feedback, and perhaps self-feedback, is that they're really the only ones who can take responsibility for their learning and to get them to feel more invested in the teaching and learning setting. The second way that you can do this is by focusing them on the learning process, explaining to them how many of the competencies that they are learning are best learned through development and practice, right? And so they need to become invested in seeing how that happens over the course of a semester, as well as hopefully over the course of their academic career. And then lastly, when I say make formative feedback part of the class context, articulate your feedback principles very clearly on your syllabus, on an assignment description, on the first day of class. Talk about why this is important and why it's part of the overall learning context. Do something the first day or when you introduce an assignment. Do something involving feedback. Ask students the same question that I asked you. What makes for good, effective formative feedback? What makes for not so effective formative feedback? And ask students to articulate their learning goals. All of those are strategies, articulating the feedback principles, having them do something related to feedback, and asking them to articulate their goals. All of those are strategies for making this part of the class context so that students understand this is just part of the way that we're going to learn together in this class. Lastly, I want to talk about ideas for incorporating formative feedback into your overall course design. I mentioned at the beginning that the way that we're talking about formative feedback is really a stance towards part of a bigger stance towards teaching and learning that recognizes that your evaluation and your feedback processes are part of that overall learning context. It's not just something that you do at the end of the semester, assign a grade, and move on. You're really invested in student learning when you take this seriously. With all of that said, it's really important that you plan and set reasonable goals for yourself. And here's where we're very happy to sit down and consult with you. Perhaps you have a large major assignment or smaller stakes assignments, or you're just interested in incorporating formative feedback in general. And we're happy to sit down and talk with you about planning out your time and what you can reasonably do in a semester. It's often the case that we start off a little too overzealous with formative feedback, and we think we're going to provide lots and lots of feedback on multiple different types of assignments, and then when we're not able to do that, or we're up at 3 a.m. wondering what we've done to ourselves, we kind of throw out the formative feedback strategy. There are ways that you can do this that do not kill yourself as an instructor. So that's a really important part of your strategy. Secondly, is you want to think about formative feedback, like I said, as part of as an overall scaffolding and sequencing strategy. So as you're thinking about in the course, the competencies that you want students to attain in the course, and then you're thinking about the assignments and how they are aligned with those competencies, and then you're thinking, okay, scaffolding. What is it that students are probably going to need a little extra help with, especially in the beginning? For example, students perhaps struggle oftentimes with writing a thesis statement. So in the beginning, I'm going to provide some extra scaffolding there. They're going to draft them in class. They're going to share. They're going to provide feedback. I'm going to provide some comments. And we're going to sequence that out so I'm not getting at the end of the semester a large project that had they received feedback early on, they would have had a much better opportunity to learn and to develop in their skills in that area. Third, use the feedback, right? Use it to answer your questions about student learning. I mentioned earlier that formative feedback is responding, it's not reacting. So there are times, and I know this has happened to me often, where I get the first round or the first draft or the initial thoughts on a project that I'm having students work on, and we're not anywhere where I thought we would be. And so I need to make adjustments, right? Or perhaps we're going a different direction, or what I thought they might have problems with, they're not, but there's other issues that we're not quite getting or aren't quite coming through. And so then I can make adjustments in my instruction for the rest of the semester. I perhaps need to add in a little bit more scaffolding on certain skills, or I see that they're okay, they're good to go. Or perhaps I have certain students that need a little more help than others on certain things, and I can figure out ways to do that. So it's very useful information. And that ties in with our last point here, that you want to feed that information forward into your future instruction. So it's not only conducive to student learning, it's conducive to you as an instructor, and hopefully by doing this, you don't have those big surprises at the end of the semester, and nor do your students on, wow, I had no idea what was expected of me or what I was actually supposed to be learning in this course. So in sum, formative feedback is about creating a context that's conducive for student learning. It's about positioning yourself as a responder rather than the traditional teacher who's examining and evaluating. And there are many strategies for responding effectively. Most important to keep in mind is that you want your feedback to be respectful, detailed, and learning focused. Very happy to meet with any of you. Please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or to Heather Bastian at CXC if we could provide any information, work with you individually or with your department. We would be happy to do so. We have just about 3 minutes left. Are there any questions or comments or strategies from the audience that you'd like to share? Well, thank you all very much. I hope you have a wonderful Tuesday, short week this week, and do not hesitate to reach out. Oh, sorry, I do see a question here. Great. From Tiffany. How do we show students how to see our comments in Canvas? I am going to refer to our host at the CTL, Lynn. Lynn, can you see this question?
Yes.
Okay.
And actually, one of the webinars that we have coming up this Thursday of using Canvas Gradebook for face-to-face classes, we'll go over how to get student assignments into Canvas so that they can be commented on there. And then for providing other comments, I would suggest attending one of our workshops on the gradebook and assignments in Canvas. There are tools inside of there called the Speed Grader. And if your problem is a student problem, I see you have a follow-up question. What I would suggest you tell them is, I know that this sounds like a cop-out, but just tell them to contact the Canvas support line and ask how to view comments. And if you have, if you're face-to-face, you can demonstrate to them how to get into that by going to the student view inside of Canvas. Is any of this ringing a bell, Tiffany? So if you're online, yeah, tell them to call Canvas for help. And if you're face-to-face, go into your Canvas site and do a student view and then navigate to the grades. And then they need to click on the actual assignment in the student thing. They need to click on that assignment, and that should take them to their feedback.
Great. Thank you, Lynn, and thank you once again to everyone for participating today. Look forward to hopefully working with you in the future. Have a great day.